Thank you all for being here this evening. I'm Cynthia Vranes-Olson. I'm thrilled to be here with you. I'm the director of the Mies van der Rohe Society IIT. We thank the Cliff Dwellers, Joan, Kristen, and the whole staff and organization for having us in this beautiful salon-like setting. The first live event in years, if not months, right? And so what we've done, yeah, bravo. But we had an amazing 18 months. Besides all the obvious difficult things that COVID brought, we had an incredible turnout on our Zoom meetings, Zoom presentations, thanks in part to our College of Architecture Dean, Reed Kroloff, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment, and the Mies Society, many members here tonight. If you could just raise your hands and just say hello. Mies Society board members, bravo. Thank you for coming and supporting us. We had hundreds of people showing up for our Zoom events, so we're trying to keep that momentum, bring things back into this kind of setting, thanks to the Cliff Dwellers, and we're recording so that we could e-blast this out to our thousands of friends and members. With that, what I'd also like to say is that Professor Kimm's books are for sale, although they haven't arrived from Germany yet, but that's part of the world that we live in right now. But Eric Medalis from IIT came down here to take your names and your request for a book this evening. Jong, Professor Kimm will sign and insert a personalized note to you. So with that, what I'd like to do is introduce, first let me just say that Steve Weiss, one of the Cliff Dwellers members, and our past board chair, hosted this evening so that we could be here tonight. So thank you, Steve. And besides the treasure that we have in Professor Kimm, as we all know him from IIT, and Reed, our dean, is going to tell you more about him, but he inspires us, he mentors us, he's generous with us in all ways, and he's here with us tonight with his wife and daughter, and flew in yesterday to Chicago to be with us and share his knowledge. So we thank him so much for all that he's done. So Professor Kimm. And finally, I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our dean, Reed Kroloff from the College of Architecture, IIT. Reed has been a practicing architect, an editor of a renowned architectural publication. He coaches, he mentors, he writes. He's practiced, I mentioned that already. He does TED Talks, he does TV shows. He's all around a wonderful mentor, a great friend, and a wonderful, wonderful support to the Mies Society and to IIT. So we're so lucky to have him, and here he is, Reed Kroloff.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you to everybody who's here tonight. I'm not used to standing at a podium, so this is sort of like having a shackle. I'm normally the kind of, full Oprah sort of presentation. But it's great to have you with us for this evening. And sitting here like this reminds me that everything that I was told about Chicago before coming here was everything in Chicago is big. It's just big. Chicago's big buildings and big food and big people. And there is a certain lot of that. There are big shoulders. But what there is also is moments like this. This is small, and it's intimate, and it feels really personal. And I want you to think about that all the way through this presentation, because it's only in this kind of intimate environment that you get to know a person like Professor Kimm. If this were 500 people, or God help us, still on Zoom, it would not be the same thing. You get him up close and personal, and that only happens because of the Mies Society. And the Mies Society again and again and again enriches the environment of architecture in the city, but particularly on behalf of the College of Architecture and IIT as a university. And it's been such a great experience for the college in the last couple of years to draw closer and closer with the Mies Society, where we co-sponsor almost everything that we do now. The two organizations, our audiences and our communities are entirely merged, and everybody feels so good about this. I can tell you from the perspective of the college, it's nothing but positive. It just is a wonderful enrichment. So I too want to thank Steve, who, working with Cynthia, made that happen. Yes, the whole board, but Steve really went out of his way and was willing to work with a kind of know-nothing new dean to make it happen. So thank you very much for that. And thank you all for coming tonight to help us welcome Jong Kimm, who doesn't really need to be welcomed. He's been a part of the community of the College of Architecture at IIT for about 60 years. And so I don't know how you welcome someone who's been there your whole life, but welcome. Jong graduated with his B.Arch in 1961, and not having had enough punishment, came back and got a master's degree, which he finished about 3 years later. He couldn't even then free himself of the grip of this place, and went to work as an architect here in Chicago for a German guy. Someone help me. Mies van der Rohe, that's it. Yeah, Anderson, for Mies. And I understand that Dirk was actually there at the same time, which is pretty amazing. If you can imagine Mies's office, we always imagine the product of Mies's office. I don't think we imagine the place of Mies's office and the kind of extraordinary collection of talent that would have been there all at once. It must have been simply electric to be in the room every day. If just these two are just an example, I can only imagine what it would have been like when you added 30 or 40 more of that type all there together. So, and then happily for us, Jong decided that he was going to come back and help share the wealth of his knowledge, and became a member of our faculty for the better part of a decade, possibly even a little longer. And I understand, I learned tonight, that the school actually asked him to be dean. Intelligently, he said no. And that was the beginning of a successful career, and there's a difference, where he found himself back in his native Korea building an exceptional practice that went on to do very important projects, civic projects, mostly projects at the civic scale, and in commercial activities, big buildings like helping to plan the Olympics and building buildings at the Olympics, and then continuing on with a series of very innovative, very IIT kinds of buildings in Seoul and other places in Korea. So an extraordinary career, and what a tremendous breadth that is included. And in the last 10, 20 years, he's devoted himself, among other things, to an intense study of architecture, like he hadn't had enough of it yet. An intense study of architecture, and we're going to see a piece of that tonight. There's been a particular focus for him on architecture of the Romanesque. And we've been very, very lucky to see him bring forth the books that you can see over here on the table, and a new one any moment now, as soon as the gods of transit figure out how to get their lives back together, and bring it to us. And tonight will introduce us to that book. So I want to thank again the folks from Cliff Dwellers for having us. I want to thank Jong Sung's family for lending him to us over and over again whenever we ask. And I want to thank all of you for being here so that you can help me welcome Jong Kimm.
Thank you, Reed, for that wonderful introduction. And I would like to extend my personal gratitude to the Cliff Dwellers for co-sponsoring this event. I'm going to talk about my third book on Romanesque architecture of Italy and Croatia. And I will flip through the slides and then tell you some of the contents in that book. Unfortunately, the book did not arrive by today, but then be patient. It will be here. All right. So, in doing this selection of about 14 churches, I thought it would be good to begin with the early Christian churches. So I show two churches which I included in the book: Santa Sabina on the left, and Mausoleum of Santa Costanza. Santa Costanza Mausoleum is about mid-4th century, and nowadays, of course, it is used for most civic functions, including wedding. But then, what a wonderful space. In pulling together about the 14 different churches, what became clear was in Italy, unlike Germany and Spain, the shadow of a Byzantine architecture you could not avoid. So on the left, there is a tiny church of Basilica of San Corrado, Saint Conrad, in small fishing town of Molfetta. But then look at, that is almost miniature sort of a Santa Sofia. Because the builders in Italy, they were always under the influence of a Byzantine church. So on the right, of course, I show San Marco in Venice, sort of a splendid collection of spaces inside. This particular church, Cathedral of San Nicola Pellegrino, there is another San Nicola in the book in Bari. But then Trani, you probably would not go there unless you are specifically going after a Romanesque church. But tiny fishing village of Trani, there is this wonderful cathedral. And I show the detail of that little port. Okay, I forgot to bring my pointer, but then on the right, that is splendid Lombard porch, columns supported by lions, and then sculpted portal. So I show just 4 images of 14 different churches. This one is in Como, and while it is less known, it's not one of the churches that would come to your mind when you are thinking of Romanesque in Italy. But then I think this is sort of a prototypical Lombard Romanesque. And that exterior in sunlight, I'm very happy to tell you that my wife, my daughter, and one of my granddaughters accompanied me on that trip to capture that particular facade. The facade I had before was taken in the morning hours and did not have the benefit of that crisp shadow. And of course, the image on the right of the eastern apse is that particular Santa Bondio church. Is very impressive in many fine details of engraving and relief, and that paired tower, very impressive. The interior, we notice that it is the columns are built of small blocks of stone, but the proportion of diameter to height is very close to the classical Roman column. Como itself was one of the Roman forts, but then apparently there were not enough recycled Roman columns, which we will see in other churches later. The next church I show in small town called Pavia. It is small now, but that was the capital city of Lombardy for 2 centuries. And because it was the capital, there are many very impressive churches, including Basilica of San Michele Maggiore, St. Michael. And the fronting street is so narrow, it's only about maybe 15 feet, so I could not really capture the frontal elevation, but then that's how it is. And the more luxurious portal on the right. The interior. First, on the right, the crossing tower with a dome on squinches, and the nave view on the left, with a sort of coloring on the stone surface. And you can see that on the right slide, the ribbed cross vault was added in Gothic period. So we come to Milan. When we think of Milan, we also think of the Gothic Cathedral of Milan, double aisle, very dim space. But then I think what is more important in Milan, in my opinion, is this Basilica of Sant'Ambrogio, the guardian saint of Milan. And this large atrium, which is a carryover from Byzantine planning. So one of the few churches which still has that atrium before the main portal. And that main portal, that theme is, I think it's copied at the Stanford University. So when you visit Stanford, you find that portal. Sant'Ambrogio is also double aisle and does not have the benefit of a clear story. So the lighting in these two shots are from the open main door. The main door is usually kept open, and that's where the light comes in. And it is a very ambitious, large span with a cross reeve bolt. So it's sort of a later phase of Romanesque, and the signs of Gothic is already here. I moved to Modena. Modena is a hometown of prosciutto, of course. Luciano Pavarotti and Mirella Freni both hail from Modena. And I show the cathedral in Modena. I think the left shot of southern transept shows what the Italian builders were capable of. Somehow they had the sense of doing whatever they do in a very sculptural and lyrical way. So more than the facade on the right, I show that the transept, southern transept of Modena. Interior, you can see that the Milan area, most buildings are built with brick, and very little of stone trim. And also, the interior had gone through a transformation so that it became cross reeve bolt during the Gothic era. Now I move to Parma. Parma, I misspoke. Parma is the home of a prosciutto, right? And the west facade, again, captured just 2 months ago with my family. And what I had before was such a miserable picture, and I was happy to be able to replace it this time. And on the right, very high and elegantly proportioned eastern end of a Parma Cathedral. The interior, Parma Cathedral, from my sense, it's decorated too much with the fresco. But then I think during that period, in 12th century, the faithful and the clergy and all the civic leaders thought it was the way to serve the God, So there's no spare space left, empty. Everything is painted. Here I show you one of the archetypical Lombard porch, lions supporting columns and the impressive portal. I go to Verona. Verona with a beige color tufa stone and brick. They have this striped exterior. And here I am unable to show the front because the file size was a little too big for PPT. So you will see the actual west facade in the book, but not in this PowerPoint. The nave, compound pier, and as it was built over a long period, perhaps close to a century, the framing system went through evolution. So the column spacing is not even. For example, there is a compound pier and a single classical column in the middle, and then the bay forward of it has 2 columns between compound pier, so and so forth, and a very high raised chancel with a see-through crypt underneath for San Zeno. And ceiling is a wooden, sort of almost inlay work of a delicate wooden structure. This is a little abbey church of San Miniato al Monte in Florence. So when you are in Florence, you cannot miss this building because it is placed high on the wall, up about probably about 30 steps from an area called the Piazzale Michelangelo. So you climb up, and what a wonderful inlay of marble. From this is probably late 9th century, but then what Alberti did in Santa Maria Novella is directly inspired, in my opinion, by what was already there. Interior. On the right, we see a wooden truss without polychromy, which we will see in Sicily later. So it's the wooden work is left alone, but then interior is all finished with marble. Very accurate and delicate marble inlay, and very prominent chapel of a crucifix in the middle. Here we also see the chancel raised about 15 feet above the main level, with the crypt completely visible to viewers. Now we come to Pisa, and the facade on the right. I must tell you that that is one that I captured 2 months ago with the help of very good weather and my family. And the picture that I had before of that main facade was so flat, without the blessing of sunlight. What a wonderful, just look at the so-called Pisan Romanesque. So vaulting is only partial. You can see the aisle is a groin vault, but then nave ceiling is a wooden truss with the graded coffer work. But then all the recycled classical columns making up Pisa Cathedral. This Abbey of Sant'Antimo in Castelnuovo dell'Abate, which is in Montalcino. The legend goes that it had the blessing of Charlemagne to establish the abbey. So it is one of the few, perhaps this may be the only church in Italy with the radiating apsidal chapel in a French manner. radiating. Mhm. So among the 14 churches, I included this Abbey of Fossanova, a Cistercian church. Nowadays, it is used as a parish church of Priverno, but then it is very typical of Cistercian, very ascetic, and totally clear of superfluous ornamentation. This is a Basilica of San Nicola in Bari. Bari is the port city with a ferry service to Greece and other places. And so the nave view, looking from the chancel toward the entrance, we can see that the builders had to deal with the tendency to sort of overturn. So they had placed the arches at a low level, reducing the clear-cut view of the nave. But then that's how it was built. Here I want to point out it is probably about 2/3 Romanesque, but then there are enough of Byzantine influence. For example, that Ciborium, I do not have a pointer on the left shot in the chancel. That's probably Byzantine influence. And on the right slide, those area with two columns, two classical columns, it is an element which you do not find in sort of a high Romanesque, but then in this body example, that is a Byzantine element called iconostasis, coming from the Eastern Church. There is a physical sort of a barrier between what the faithful would be seated and then what the clergy will be. So, iconostasis. I show two churches in Sicily. This one is Monreale, which is a sub-city of the capital of Sicily, Palermo. It's called the Cathedral of Santa Maria la Nuova. And this is a good example of Sicilian Norman architecture. And once we go inside, we do not see the stone vaulting yet. It's mostly wood. But then I want to emphasize this interlaced arches, which directly come from the Muslim influence. Long years of domination by Muslims in Sicily, who were eventually vanquished by William the Norman, not to be confused with William the Conqueror, but then the William, Two views of the nave. The view on the left shows a wooden roof structure with a very delicate polychromy and great deal of a mosaic on the wall and on the apse, Christ Pantocrator. I want to point your attention to that mosaic. It has a, I would say, human expression, not godly expression, but then human. The artist and the clergy, of course, must have approved that depiction of Christ in that very, very human expression. And that is very important example, so that when Kaiser Wilhelm went about sort of resurrecting that Maria Laach Abbey in Germany, I think he specifically told his builders to model it after the mosaic in Monreale. This is in a sort of a smaller city in Sicily, at the eastern end of the island, Cefalù. And it has a certain similar architectural composition, 2 towers, arcaded portal. But then look at the view on the left. That sort of it has a defensive function, because it was always invaded by either Muslims or pirates, for that matter. Interior view. The wooden structure is left without any decoration, but then they sort of decorated the apse with the later structure, cross-rib bolt, and also apse mosaic. Again, Christ Pantocrator, but here it is not that human face. I have included one late Byzantine church in Porec in Croatia, because many scholars consider this Euphrasiana Basilica and one other church in Italy to be the conduit of Byzantine architecture into the European continent. So it has that specific importance in history. The basilica was partially destroyed by an earthquake several centuries ago, and the southern aisle were redone in a later Romanesque period, but then this is mostly Byzantine, the way it is, with very impressive ciborium and the mosaic. So that is what I have included in the book. And perhaps, Cynthia, do we go into questions, and how much time would you allow?
We're fine.
Thank you.
We're inspired, and we probably have a few questions for you. So, open to the audience.
Okay.
Some questions. Joan?
So I was really interested in the church in Verona with that sort of striping. Is that something that you see elsewhere, or is that typical simply of Verona?
I see striping in other parts of Italy too, but then that is strongest in Verona. Yes.
Any reason for that you know of?
I think that particular San Zeno Maggiore in Verona was built with a tufa stone and brick. And I think instead of using tufa stone alone or brick alone, I think the master mason chose to make it a little more lively by making it a stripe. I think that's what, yeah. Yes?
You've obviously seen hundreds of churches. Do you have a personal favorite? A place that you would choose above all?
I think in this particular set of 16, the shutter I have used over that top, second from right, that tiny abbey church in Florence, San Miniato. Yes, that's in history books. It's not even classified as a Romanesque. It's called Proto-Romanesque, meaning before Romanesque. But I like it. I like it best. Maju.
I was just going to ask you. I think I asked you this before. How much of those structures have been renovated, or and how that renovation looked within the authentic original?
Could you repeat the question for the audience?
I will repeat Professor Eldimeri's question. In the course of a renovation, what changes were brought about in these medieval churches? I did not really emphasize it while I was speaking, but then if you just refresh your memory into Parma Cathedral, in spite of a Romanesque exterior, interior has become totally Gothic. So that's how the degree of transformation from what the patron clergy set out to do, what the succeeding master masons did, and they did not really worry about maintaining a style. Nobody worried whether that should be kept as a Romanesque. But then I think later master masons built it the best way they know how. So usually it turned out to be a cross-rib vault, whereas it started with a very Romanesque vaulting.
We have two of Professor Kimm's students here, and I think one of them, Stephen Weiss, has a question.
Please.
The Verona, I've been to Verona, but I've never seen that cathedral. So in me, where does that fit in the timeline of Romanesque cathedrals, particularly the technique of building them?
All right. The question has to do with San Zeno Maggiore in Verona. Where does that architecture fit into the timeline of Romanesque? I think it belongs to the early Romanesque. For example, it was before stone vaulting. And the Verona has a very beautiful wooden work for the roof. And it is early Romanesque and almost indispensable in the timeline of Romanesque development.
Are there any further questions? Kevin Harrington. Well, thank you, Professor Kimm.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Steve Weiss to come up and close our evening. Steve was a student, as was Keith Olson of Professor Kimm's, and so
Let
with
me
delight,
let
Steve
me
Weiss.
stand up and at least thank Cynthia, Steve.
I think I've probably said this before, but as a student of Jong Soung's, in the fourth year of the Mies curriculum, we were hard at modern architecture. We were hard at Miesian architecture. This is in the very early 70s. And we got to Professor Kimm's studio, Jong Soung's studio, and his class was all about seeing as a modern architect, seeing space as a structure as a space-forming device, seeing material, understanding, visualizing space. But then every once in a while he gave a lecture on Gothic cathedrals. He wasn't yet talking about Romanesque cathedrals, but by God, we learned about every major Gothic cathedral in Europe in that year of studio, and it was fabulous. And when we all graduated and ended up making trips to Europe, I have thousands of slides of Gothic cathedrals that parrot Jong Soung's slides. In any case, this series of publications on Romanesque architecture are just priceless. This is the third of the series, and I think there's two more, if I'm not mistaken, probably still being photographed. And we look forward to launching those also, of course. On behalf of the Mies Society, thank you to the Cliff Dwellers. It's a delight. Reed was right. This is just one of the most wonderful, intimate spaces for a program like this. And the Mies Society is delighted to be able to use it and to share it with the Cliff Dwellers. So thank you for that, and thank you for all coming, and thank you to Jong Soung Kimm for sharing this enormous and extraordinary collection of work with us. Thank you. Oh, and then there's the commercial message. Please visit the table and purchase copies. The group that's somewhere in a container somewhere off Los Angeles will eventually get here, but we promise you'll get it if you buy it. So please go for it. Thank you.
Thank you all again. Have a wonderful evening and a safe trip home. Yeah, thank you to the Cliff Dwellers.